Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the latest on the BOMA webinar series. Today's topic is, what are your tenants thinking? And at this time, I'd like to introduce you to your moderator today, Sarah Vandenbelt. Sarah?
Thank you, Dean, and welcome everyone to the latest in a series of webinars BOMA Ottawa has organized as a way to continue to stay in touch with our members, especially given the exceptional times we find ourselves in. We do plan to allow time for questions at the end, so if you have any questions, we encourage you to use the chat feature, which Dean will monitor and share with us as time permits. We'd also like to thank and recognize Capital Office Interiors for their sponsorship support of today's webinar. As we continue to get close to the government goals for vaccination, we have to consider what comes next. Over the past year, even when infection rates were not peaking, our BOMA network canvassed their members, and typically we found that landlords across North America were reporting building occupancy through the pandemic was less than 30%. Often employees were rotating with 1/3 or less of a tenant staff entering offices on any given day. In the US especially, the return to something approaching normal is beginning to happen, and we can expect to see or hope the same to happen here in Canada. But as businesses start to figure out how to operate and manage their staff in a post-pandemic world, what are their employees, and by extension, our tenants thinking? What worries them, and what would make them feel more at ease in coming back to the workplace? To look at this question, Steelcase conducted research worldwide to try to find a handle on what our tenants are thinking. Our guest today is Richard Benoit, who is a senior consultant with the Steelcase Applied Research and Consulting team. He has over 10 years of experience of leveraging research and insights to help organizations create highly effective workplaces that align with their culture and business strategies, and who was a part of the research conducted that we're going to discuss today. So welcome, Richard.
Great, thank you for having me. I appreciate the opportunity to share some of our research with all of you.
Fantastic. So to kick things off, Richard, maybe tell us a little bit about the research Steelcase conducted and what you wanted to figure out from it.
Sure. And Steelcase being a global company, we have access to a really, be able to cast a pretty wide net. So we did research in 11 countries. Obviously, the United States and Canada were a big part of that, but looking at also Western Europe as well as Asia Pacific to really get a handle on what was going on in different parts of the world. So we've done, obviously we talked about, 52,000 survey responses and conversations. We've held roundtables, we've done webinars, we've done one-on-one interviews with leadership as well as with individual contributors in organizations, because we find it's really important to understand what business leaders are thinking, as well as how people are adapting to what's been going on over the last year and a half, and also looking at how environments are now starting to recognize how work's going to change in the future.
Well, Steelcase is known for their research, so let's dive into the findings of this particular project and maybe talk a bit about what you're hearing about the future of work.
Sure. So, I'm sure all of you have been reading articles about what companies are doing. And we keep hearing this whole thing about hybrid work. And of course, the big question is, well, what does that really mean? If we think about prior to the pandemic, less than 10% of knowledge workers did any kind of remote working. And most of those people work for consultants like Deloitte or Accenture. And so we're starting to see, organizations start to be far more flexible. So we hear about companies like Google and Microsoft that are, plan to accommodate some level of flexibility. Then we also hear other companies thinking on other extremes where, Ford has been very vocal about letting people work from home be their primary workplace. And then you hear some of the banking companies like Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan Chase, which are really much more around, we want everybody back in the office. So companies are, all over across the board on this. One of the things that we track, and this was a little bit earlier in research where, there was a handful of companies that were thinking that this work from home thing was so great, we're just gonna let everybody stay home and never bring people back. We found, maybe a quarter of companies thinking, we're going to go back just the way it was and everybody will be back in the office. And 72% were thinking about flexibility. When we did this research earlier this year, we saw these numbers. What we are starting to see is this shift to more hybrid and less of this, we're all going to be back in the office full time. As companies start to address the need or the demand for more flexibility and autonomy that employees are looking for. And one of the interesting factors on this is the war for talent. As companies think about, how do we attract and retain, we're starting to see studies show that lots of people are now thinking about, well, maybe there's someplace else I can work that is going to offer flexibility if my company doesn't. And these, what we are seeing companies really wrestling with is balancing individual sentiment. Do I want to work from home or do I want to be in the office? How does my team operate so that I can get my work done? And what does the business need in order to be successful? So that balance between all of these things is really driving companies to be a little bit hesitant around how do we move forward. And interestingly enough, we start to see only 11% of companies that we have surveyed have a plan of what hybrid really means. You have 4% that haven't even started thinking about it. But if you look at the vast majority, 32%, have some idea, they're talking about it, but there's no really vision or a plan. Or they might, another 32% have a vision around the leadership. We might, they might be thinking, well, we are going to offer some degree of flexibility for our employees. We don't really know what that's going to look like yet. So this is obviously, companies are very wary about what to do, how to move forward. And I think one of the struggles they have is they want to make decisions that are based on the last 18 months of unprecedented experimentation. And so they're really hesitant around making a decision because all of the, everything that people have gone through over the last 18 months are probably going to be a whole new learning curve over the next 18 months. So decisions they're making now based on how people feel are probably going to change again. So this, again, this unprecedented experimentation is causing a lot more concern. And so, where they're sort of, kind of figuring out is, okay, we may have in-office workers. So who are those people that really need to be on site or want to be on site all the time? On the other end, who doesn't really need to come in or doesn't want to come in, but then we get these hybrid workers of, it might be 2 to 4 days a week. And I think one of the challenges that companies have is when everybody was in the office, we kind of knew what to do. Everybody went by default. When everybody was at home, we figured it out because we knew how to connect with everybody because no one was there. Well, now what happens when we have some people in and some people out, and who's, how do we know where people are is going to add to that complexity. And so what we're starting to see with these mobility patterns is that, a lot of companies are thinking that their long-term workplace strategies will change. And whether that's, okay, if we have fewer people in the office, do we really need as much space? Or if we have fewer people in the office, can we do better with the spaces that we have? At one time, we thought satellite offices might be an important part of this strategy. We're hearing a little bit of that, but not as much as we may have expected. And then the idea of like, how do companies approach hybrid working where, 29% of companies are thinking, well, we'll just let the employees decide for themselves, and it'll be kind of random. 42% are, they're asking, okay, employees are going to work consistent days. I'm going to work in the office Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and my work at home. And then 21% companies are going to tell people when they need to be in. But again, it goes back to that sentiment of how do organizations, again, think about what does the business need to be successful? How do teams need to connect? Because obviously, if people are going into the office because of who's there needs to be some sort of guidelines. Because if we give everybody full autonomy, how do we know, people are going to be there at the same time when they do need to work with others? So there needs to be, the organizations probably need to provide some guardrails to make sure that there isn't, this autonomy without anything is just, if I come into the office and the people I need aren't there, why do I come in? I'm just going to not necessarily come at home at all. So I'm curious, we've got the chat open. If, people have questions, more than happy to sort of take them as they come in.
Richard, I'm kind of curious. You mentioned in one of your first slides that only 5% of companies are saying that they're going to go satellite. Considering the war, the war on talent and specialized talent, I would have thought that number would have been way higher. That, especially in the tech world, talent's so expensive in North America. Wouldn't you think that they'd be looking outside of North America for more remote talent? 5% seems so low.
No, that's actually a very valid point, and there are definitely companies that are looking at that, casting that global net for talent, because you can potentially find talent in lower cost markets, and I think that the struggle is, how do you maintain culture and that sense of inclusion? And some organizations have figured it out, and have been really successful with a completely remote workforce. And I think that there are certain roles that lend themselves to being, where you're full-time remote. But I think the culture of the organizations, the ones that are out there and done it, have really spent a lot of effort to really create that online culture of keeping people connected. So I think that it's, in the tech world, people are used, I think there's probably a little bit more acceptance of these virtual connections that people make. And I think that there's probably a population out there that likes that autonomy and that isolation, but it's probably a smaller population than the companies, that's probably really out there. So it'll be really interesting. Again, this is what people are expecting right now. And I think that, and we are seeing companies offer full-time remote work has an opportunity to get talent where they may not have access to it in their local market. So I think it's going to, I think that 5% reference companies that were going to be, everybody was virtual. And so I think this idea that, where a company is, is primarily virtual employees, I think that's still going to remain really small. But I think as companies start to look for talent, then that global search is going to become much more pervasive in lots of companies.
Richard, we have a question from one of our attendees. He wants to know if the research suggested that the desire to work remotely shifted depending on age or seniority within an organization, or possibly any other factor.
Actually, yes. Age and seniority do have an impact. People who are more tenured in their job and later in their sort of professional career are more likely to want to work remotely because they have established networks, they have their established skill sets, they feel they can be more autonomous. What we're finding is with younger, less experienced workers really value the mentorship, the skill development that really happens in the office. So we're starting to see actually younger workers have as much as people are thinking, well, young workers can work anywhere. They're much more proficient with technology, except that they realize that in order for them to advance their careers, networking is really important. So we talk about this fear of missing out. If I'm not visible, am I going to get looked over for a new project or a promotion? Or how do I improve how do I improve professionally if I'm not really there with others? Because I'm really newer in my career, I'm in a more of a learning mode. So I'm probably more likely to want to be present for the professional development opportunities.
All right. So our audience today are property managers and service providers to the buildings they manage. So do your findings suggest that these attitudes will impact the way businesses, and by extension, our tenants, will think about the workplaces?
Absolutely. So as we think about, hybrid working and, what does that mean to the workplace? Obviously, we expect some changes. So one of the most significant ones is as companies think about density and occupancy in their workplace, where traditionally everybody had an assigned seat. What they're looking at is, well, if people are only in the office a couple days a week, do we start to shift to more unassigned seating? So, companies are certainly thinking, okay, if you're in the office 4 or 5 days a week, those become residents. And so they're thinking about, okay, somebody in most of the time does have a dedicated workstation or an office, but we're seeing, lots of organizations starting to think about this. Not necessarily, I wouldn't call it hoteling, because it isn't just about I come in and squat in one place and go to a meeting and squat somewhere else. But when I come into the office, I still need to be able a place to work for the day, but I may share that setting with other people on different days. So we're also seeing how the value of collaborative space is also going to change, because we think of, when people coming into the office, they're really there to connect. And so having places where people have easy access to work with others is going to become an important part of shifting that. And so, when we think about how spaces will evolve, technology is going to be an incredibly important factor, since, if, half of us are in the office and half of us are still remote, technology for, collaborative technology. So we talk about, 66% hybrid collaboration spaces. How do we, create these environments that support mixed collaboration? So the era of walking into a conference room where we're sitting around a table with a speakerphone is completely obsolete. If I can work from home and have a better experience working with my colleagues than coming into the office, I'm not going to come to the office. So the technology element is going to be an important part. And the other piece, we talk about this idea of high performance ancillary spaces. We know that socialization is going to be an important part of coming back to the office. People are going to want to connect. So this idea that I can work or converse and chat and connect with my colleagues is going to create this idea that these spaces are going to be multimodal. I don't want to come in and just sit in one place. I should be able to work in multiple places to be able to support the way that I'm working. And so one of the things that we're seeing, significantly increase is companies interested in experimenting. Again, nobody's sure what the answers are. And we get asked all the time about case studies. Who's come back to the office and what did they do and how has it worked? And it's like, run planet. No, we're not there yet. People are still learning what this will be like. And so we're all kind of learning together. But what companies are thinking about is, can we try some of these new ideas and see how well they work? And doing it on a small scale. We're not ready to make big investments into these changes, but can we do some reconfigurations or add in some options that we didn't have before and see how our users take advantage of them? And so the challenge, of course, is with these spaces to be both safe and compelling. And, when we think about, the opportunities for people to come in, how are they sort of adapting to these spaces? And we know that what we're starting to see is there's, this idea of me and we spaces. So when I'm coming in, I need a place for me to work by myself. And so the need for focus is becoming more predominant, where, this shift to the open office, where everybody complained about the noise. Everybody liked working at home because it was quiet. So we have to obviously provide better quiet places for people to work, but also, places where we can work together. This idea of more flexible spaces so they're not regimented by, everything's kind of nailed down to the floor. More options for both enclosed for individual use as well as open for group use. And then we talk about braiding physical and digital. How do we improve that digital experience? And so we think about spaces that attract and engage people, that they're dynamic and energizing and inspiring and productive. And two places where I see people starting to make changes and again and pilot these ideas are things like social hubs and hybrid collaboration spaces. So the idea of the social hub is, people struggle with isolation and collaboration during, working from home. So that we want to create this buzz and this energy, and we want people to feel like they can come in and they can work and they can connect and they can collaborate. And so these central locations where, people come in and they see what's going on and they're excited to be back to know what's going on with the rest of the organization. And then, just ideas around what these spaces look like is, we have access to food and beverage, we have access to technology, we can see what else is going on in the organization. So we're really starting to blur the lines between, okay, is this just a coffee bar where people hang out? Or are we thinking about, we can go to a Starbucks or a Second Cup and actually have a meeting and do something that's a little bit more meaningful. And then even with these hybrid collaboration spaces, being able to support both digital and analog collaboration, where some people are in the room, some people are calling in, but recognizing that the dynamics of working with content. So if we're doing some brainstorming, how do the people that are online have the same experience that people that people in the room are having? And again, create these flexible spaces that accommodate a range of people within the space. And so even some of those principles that we're looking at are, where do you position the display and how do the speakers work and how do you provide acoustical support? Where are the cameras so that everybody feels like, no matter where I am in that space, I'm still connected, and that we have access to be able to make sure that we still create this sense of community and connection, whether we're physically in the room or that we're just calling into those spaces. So again, we think about technology being in a part of this, but also the behavior changes. When we think about standing for these sessions so that we're all at eye height on the camera. So it isn't these static environments where we're all sitting around the room, but how do we support active collaboration even if we're not physically present? So, so these are some of the things that we start to see companies starting to kind of play around with. Let's introduce a piece of technology. Let's try to reconfigure our collaboration spaces and start to do these, that where it's minimal risk, but there's a huge reward, and start to experiment with our own people to see what's going to really work well for our organizations. So be curious to see if, if there's questions, have some of if this is something that your tenants are starting to question.
Richard, we do have a couple of questions from the audience. Seeing that the stats on one of your slides suggest that a lot of the research was done with companies with lots of employees, do the numbers tell the same story for smaller companies as well, or not?
Definitely. I think that there are certainly a number of these principles that are applicable regardless of company size. I think where we're seeing more, particularly the comment around the statistics around unassigned versus assigned desks, tend to be more pervasive with larger companies. So if I've got 10,000 employees, and we know that on any given day, 40% of those people are going to be in the office, there's a substantial real estate implication around having the number of people. So I think that's probably one of those characteristics we see more pervasive with larger organizations. But certainly we're actually seeing with smaller organizations the interest in piloting actually higher, because they feel they have a little bit more control over what they might be wanting to do with and thinking about being able to get their thumb on the pulse of what people are thinking. But but again, this changes in these behaviors and those expectations, certainly we're seeing regardless of the size of the company.
You do talk about collaborative space, but what about common areas of an office building? Do they play a role in giving a choice for work? The example given by one of our audience members today is, can someone work remotely in the lobby of the office building?
Oh, absolutely. And so when we think about these public spaces, whether they're in a client's floor or in the building, I think that because people have learned to work remotely. So I think I go back to when everybody came into the office, they did it by default, and you just kind of went through your workday. When everybody went home to work, everyone was forced to learn how to work differently. So if you were primarily in the office, the idea of like, well, could you work at home? Well, no, because I have this at my desk and I need my 2 monitors and my binders are there, my reference material. And so you just kind of did it. Well, now that people have learned new behaviors, so their ability to work in different places, they now know whether or not that works for them or not. So people are less, far less regimented around, well, I can only do this activity in one place. So you think about, even if you're working at home, how many people have, they may have a desk at home, they might have they actually might have an office, they might be sitting in their living room or at their kitchen table or on their back porch, and they move from place to place knowing that they've got those options. And so coming back into the office, if it's only, I get to go sit at my gray cube with no access to daylight and I don't see anybody, that's not going to be really compelling. So people have learned that they can work in different places. And so, giving people those options and those opportunities is going to help make the workplace more complementary to work from home.
So it was kind of addressed in one of the questions in the chat about the common areas, but also given the findings that you spoke about, how may property owners and managers address kind of the situation that we now find ourselves in? Do you have any other examples?
Sure. So, speaking specifically around the safety component, because that's obviously one of the challenges that is posed for for people. There's still some hesitancy to come back, and as much as people like everybody's out there. And it's interesting that particularly here in the United States, where the mask mandates and the distancing have really relaxed, we're certainly seeing a major shift that we didn't expect. It's accelerated far faster, and it's great that in Canada you're finally your vaccine delivery is starting to ramp up the way to meet some of those expectations. But there's still people who are, hesitant and, concerned. And so this idea of that, this idea of human behavior taking precedent is like, people are still going to have, some reservations. So we think that from a facility standpoint, you can ease a lot of that anxiety. So we know that there's this, cognitive overload that people have. If they're really anxious around coming into the office, they're not going to, that's really going to limit their desire to come in. So some of these characteristics around air management, cleaning and disinfecting and surface materials obviously can make a difference. And so in the surveys that we've done, we found that air quality is a significant factor. And I think historically air quality was always an issue, and that companies just sort of like ignored or just because of the complexity of dealing with that. but things like adherence to safety protocols, facility cleanliness. I think that from property management standpoint, these are all things that you probably have been taking into account. And so, whether it's, a tenant concerned about these or, companies that own their own buildings, these are all, characteristics of the building that, that individuals were sort of like, okay, how am I putting myself at risk as I come into the office? And so how can I start to, property owners start to mitigate that? And so some of the things that we've started to see companies think about is, if you're familiar with the WELL certification, and this isn't necessarily about promoting, a WELL certification, but it's an indicator around how that property is meeting guidelines. And so has facilities start to improve on what they've been doing. It's great, that you've done these improvements, but if people don't know you've made these improvements, you're not taking advantage of it. That anxiety is still there. And one of the reasons I sort of put this up there is that, certainly with the promotional activities that are going behind this, if you've seen the, J-Lo and Lady Gaga promoting, on TV, I think it's an interesting opportunity to reach the public around the value of a healthy building. And so, to have the label on the building, it's not so much, again, that it's been certified, a WELL certified building, but the idea that there is evidence to the people, to the occupants of the building that have made, that you're making investments in the quality of the wellness of the building. So some of these ideas that we've thrown out here around this idea of both safety accommodations and compelling amenities. So as you make improvements to the air handling system, how do people know that you've made those investments, that there is, cleaner air in the building than what was before? But also, for, maybe older buildings where it may be difficult to make those improvements, the addition of standalone air cleaners in the ultraviolet, those ultraviolet germicidal irradiation units, the UVGI, so that when people come into the building, they see these things in place. So they feel like, oh, all right, there's been investment here in my personal well-being. Cleanable surfaces, this sort of shift to fabrics to harder surfaces, and not that they, necessarily, think about comfort, but, is it, it goes along with this visible display of cleaning. So, I always joked about I was growing up as a kid in the motels, there would always be the little paper wrapper on the toilet seat that said, this has been cleaned and sanitized for your safety, or, so that, you people coming in know it's there. Or when you go into the airport and there's a little plaque on the wall that says, the restroom's been serviced, in the last, 15 minutes or whatever it is. Those kind of visible displays, I think, are really important. And even within our own company, being able to see people, going through and wiping down doorknobs and, straightening out conference rooms, whatever that might be, so that, it's evident, it's obviously there. The thing about improving wayfinding and signage, as people are looking for, spaces in the building, this idea of, I want to get from point A to point B as quickly as possible, so that I'm not just kind of wandering around and, and so, can we improve the efficiency of circulation in the buildings? And then even visitor protocols. So are there guidelines so that, when people who are, resident to the building aren't really, has concern about, who else is coming into the building, where, okay, we know that as an occupant of the building, we're following the criteria and the protocols, but, who else is coming into the building? So we're putting things out there that might sort of support that. And then the other thing, we talk about these compelling amenities. A lot of these start to look at well-being, and we look at the research around what people like about working from home, and it was this work-life balance. It was this sort of, not only the physical well-being of being at home because I can get up and move, I can adjust my workday, but this idea of cognitive well-being, I can kind of take a break when I need to. So when we think about what you could offer your tenants, thinking about how could you help them do some simple reconfigurations that have already there, and again repurpose, thinking about being more open to experimenting with your tenants, so that they're not making whole-scale changes, but maybe there's some opportunities to to work with them on making some minor changes. On-site retail, so things like coffee shop and salons or whatever it is. So this idea of communal spaces that are within the building that let people kind of go other places to work. The internet backbone we will see an increase in technology. Again, for, we think about how many, these Zoom meetings aren't going to go away. Hopefully there's fewer of them, but they're not going to go away. So has companies in your tenants in your buildings, if it's, there's an opportunity to increase the the pipeline for internet access, that is we are going to see that increase. Has brought, has Wi-Fi across those floors, the access to that and capacity and bandwidth is definitely going to need to increase. Outdoor working spaces, we know that, again, from working from home, the ability to sit on your front deck or your back deck or your front porch. But again, the ability to have a more conducive workplace that does include the outside. In fact, one of the things we're doing in our own facility in Grand Rapids that came out of our own research is we're actually building a big patio, a working patio off of one floor of the building that will actually have reservable meeting spaces and Wi-Fi and electrical power so that people can literally go out the back door and sit in a space and work. Workout facilities and showers, respite spaces, again, things that, maybe an individual tenant really, within their, don't have the capacity to put on, to do something by themselves. But what we find is, the ability or the access to some of these spaces can be a really, a great way to sort of, again, adapt this idea of work-life balance between, okay, do I come into the office and do I work from home, so that we have places that really support the whole well-being initiative for someone to come, back to the office. Because as much as, companies like, well, yeah, we really want people back in the office, a lot of companies are really struggling because the idea that, well, you have to be in the office to get your work done no longer holds any water. That, as somebody said, the genie's out of the bottle with that one, telling people, well, you have to be in the office, unless you're doing you have a job that really requires for you to be on site because, you need access to equipment. Obviously at Steelcase, the people that run our model shop and test lab can't really do that from home. So there's always going to be some people in some roles that their work is dependent on being in the office. But for a lot of other people, it's like, well, yeah, they're, for the last year or so, they've been quite capable of getting their work done. So we need to find other, that idea that, well, you could, you're going to be more productive in the office. Well, some people will be more productive in the office. Some people are going to be more productive working at home. But we start to see lots of organizations that are shifting away from this idea of individual productivity. So we can do our task-centric work at home. So we feel really good about what I accomplished. But businesses need more than just what I accomplished. We need to be able to connect and share ideas and drive innovation. And that obviously is going to be better supported when we're all in the office together.
Interesting, because I'm a broker, so looking at a bunch of these like compelling amenities and the way to promote the safety, I think for landlords moving forward and for agents, I think it's going to be a selling point. Like that has to be highlighted from the beginning for people to feel comfortable signing a new lease at a building. So there's one more question that we're going to address from the chat before we wrap up. The question is, do you see this trend changing if we have another recession? For example, when employees are not calling the shots as they are today?
That's a really good question.
Kind of a doom and gloom question, but I mean, it's a fair question.
Absolutely. Because clearly right now, workers are in the driver's seat. The war for talent is unbelievable right now. And we've got people, questioning, hey, do I really need this? Is there something else I can do? Because everybody's had time to rethink this. Certainly, when we see, should there, hopefully nobody's really anticipating a recession, but this isn't going to last forever, because nothing ever does. So I think that, we will see the pendulum swing back on all of this. I think right now the pendulum is swinging in favor of the worker. And so, companies are willing to, be far more flexible. I think at some point, it will probably swing back. And, I don't think it will go all the way to where the employer is still going to start to, go back to, we're going to tell you exactly what to do and when to do it. I think that there, it's the same thing with, are people going to be working from home all the time versus on the office all the time? So right now, the pendulum is all the way at the other end where everybody's remote. And so, is everybody going to come back in? I think over the next couple of years, we're going to start to see a lot of shifts. And I think that this is actually why companies are sort of struggling making decisions, because the information they have to work with right now is based on, the last year. And so, we see companies that are thinking, hey, this remote work is so great, we're just going to cut a lot of our real estate. And we're not so sure that that's really a good idea, because everything right now is so volatile. And so, it's like, well, repurposing may make some sense, but getting rid of real estate seems to be a little bit of an extreme measure. Now, granted, if you had a lot of excess real estate to begin with, which, I'm not sure a lot of companies had done that. But one of the factors that we kind of remind companies is that in the cost of a business, their facilities and real estate represent maybe 10 to 15% of the cost of the business, of running the business. Their talent is still somewhere between 60 to 70%. So, yep, you might save a little bit on your real estate, and that's goes right to the bottom line. But your impact to 70% of your cost can be overwhelming. So if you start to think about, okay, and this is what we saw at the last recession, where companies like IBM and Yahoo and Bank of America created these huge remote workforces to save on real estate. So yeah, they saved millions of dollars by sending people to work from home, only to realize that the productivity of all those people went way down and eventually brought them all back to the office. Because managing those remote employees is much more difficult than managing those on site. So again, the original 5% of companies that we're going to keep remote workers, you have to have a business model and a culture that supports those remote workers. So having some in and having some out really adds quite a bit of complexity. And I think with these companies that had, hey, we've got a bunch of people in the office and we've got a bunch of people that don't come in, managing that was so complex that it really failed. And so they brought everybody back in. So I think that, this idea of like, we kind of got to hold on here for a little bit rather than making, these really, these really, major decisions, particularly around real estate, that could end up, because we all know, like, once you've cut the real estate, getting it back is a major acquisition.
It's interesting. I still don't quite think that there's quite enough data to make those grand statements like you're saying. But I mean, using the IBM example, when tech was different, the tools available were different. So I feel like there will be a big focus on data and productivity moving forward to be able to leverage to make those decisions. But there's one more question, and then I think we'll wrap up now. This one is related to air quality. So are the demands of the quality of office space, air quality, well certified, that's the example that you used, in excess of what people have in their homes? I don't know if you know this offhand.
Oh, I saw a study that identified air quality characteristics, and it had to do with air exchanges. And well, again, it depends on, if you keep your windows open, if you live in a climate where you can keep your windows open, you probably have the highest level of air quality because the air exchange is so frequent. But typically the air exchange in the office, if you think about just sort of the basics, it was the air exchange, I think, in a typical office was actually the lowest, and it was geared to air efficiency. So if you think about LEED certification, it put efficiency over quality, and what WELL is doing is it's kind of reversing that. So one of the things is, people are concerned about air quality on airplanes, and air exchange on airplanes is like every couple of minutes, as opposed to in the office it's every couple of hours. So the conventional guidelines for air exchange with the office was one of the lowest. And so this is where, the criteria that's been developed through WELL or some of the other, ASHRAE, in improving that was actually increasing the outdoor air exchange, which obviously increases costs because now you have to, deal with temperature and humidity and pollutants to be able to filter that outdoor air. So again, the more outdoor air you're bringing in, the higher your HVAC costs go up. So it's always that balance.
I'm sure there's multiple property managers watching this, like screaming at their screens with the answer. That question did not come from a property manager, but you did really well. So thank you again. I think our time is up. I want to thank Richard for sharing the findings from the research Steelcase conducted. The slides from this webinar will be available to everyone that registered. We'll send out details in the next few days. And I'd also like to encourage everyone to watch for the BOMA newsletter for upcoming webinars that we're putting on in the fall. And thank you again to Capital Office Interiors for helping make this webinar happen. I want to thank you all for joining us and wishing you guys all a great weekend.
Great. Thank you for having me.